Hey, it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to part 26 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Edgar leaned in toward Virgil until his nose was almost touching his. "We'll string you up just like you did Willie," he warned as Leonard walked over and tossed the basket of leftovers into the cell and set a jar of water and a slop bucket and some toilet paper nearby as Edgar stood up glaring at the old man. "You better think about what I said," he warned as they left him alone in the jail. William Post limped over. He followed the sheriff back inside. The sheriff unfolded him an old army surplus cot and got him a chair. "You keep an eye on this old son of a dog," he told William. The tavern was a busy place that night as friends gathered, offering their condolences and bringing food to comfort the grieving family. And there were also some busybodies who just wanted to know what was going on. They were gawkers at an accident. Miss Hattie and I kept the coffee on and baked up an extra pan of biscuits. Late that night, when everyone had settled down and gone home, I went into the parlor to find Lenny sitting with Aldous Wells, Uncle John, Buddy Jackson, and Leonard. Effie was still sitting beside the fire in that rocking chair, and the baby was crying in the room at the end of the hall when I told them all good night and I went to get my bath. I heard Aunt Mary and Lenny come back to their rooms after I did. No one kissed me good night or came to say my prayers with me that evening, and I fell asleep dreaming of Willie swinging in the branches of that tree from the end of that rope. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen in my life, that poor boy, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Willie hadn't robbed a single soul. The next morning when I awoke, everyone was in the kitchen, including the sheriff. When I walked in, I couldn't help but overhear the conversation, and it sent a chill through me. I recalled what I thought I'd heard Miss Effie saying the day before when she was sitting beside the fire. "What do you think could have happened to old Virgil?" Uncle John asked. Leonard shrugged his thin shoulders and looked at the sheriff. "From what I could tell, the old man choked on something during the night and just died. And William was sleeping, and his hearing's bad, so he wouldn't have heard him." "Serves him right, though, I say," Miss Hattie announced, slamming a skillet down on the stove and making me jump half out of my skin. "But now we may never find out who those two other men were," Mr. Harvey said. But Leonard said he had a pretty good idea who they were all right. He said they'd just have to prove it. "Who do you think they are?" Uncle John asked, but Leonard said he'd rather not say right then. As Buddy listened, his jaws clenched in anger. "We'll check with the gas station in Sequoia and see if Joe happened to see them," Leonard added, as Miss Hattie turned to them and made a suggestion. "Why don't you go and talk to the Tolberts? They're always sitting out on their front porch in the afternoons, and they see nearly every car that goes by. Miss Hattie told me to go round and gather everyone up for breakfast in the dining room, and I went to tell the Jacksons that it was ready. I didn't see Miss Effie anywhere and asked Sally, Willie's youngest sister, where she might be. Sally looked up from a magazine she'd been looking at. She went back home. Aunt Effie won't go to funerals. She'll pay her respects in her own way." Puzzled by what Sally had said, I went back to the kitchen to tell Hattie and help her. William Post came back from the jail for breakfast and sat down with the rest of them. Leonard and the sheriff went back to the jail and took Virgil's body over to the funeral home and then drove down the mountain to Sequoia in their cars. At the gas station, Joe Dunn said a car like the one they were looking for had stopped in for some gas, but not around the time they were speaking of. He said it had been earlier in the day. Sheriff Hale asked if Joe knew who the men had been, but he said he hadn't seen them before. Joe hated to hear the news about Willie Jackson and said old Virgil should hang himself, and he almost laughed when he heard that the old man had died in the night. Serves him right, he said. You just don't mess with one of Effie's folk, he added. And if I was you, I'd check up on Sand Mountain. Sounds like those boys could have been some of them clan from up there, Joe recommended. Ben Leonard and Sheriff Davies left the station and stopped by the Talberts and found them right where Miss Hattie said they'd be and stepped up on their front porch to chat with them. I did see the car, Hal Talbert told them matter-of-factly. That car came flying through here 90 miles an hour to nothing. It killed one of my chickens that got in the road. He frowned as he pointed to the remains of his leftover breakfast on a plate nearby. Did you see who was in the car? Sheriff Hale asked. Mrs. Tolbert nodded her head. It was them damned old Crudup boys from up at White Rock. Ricky was at the wheel, and I think his brother was riding shotgun in the passenger seat. What did they do besides run over my chickens? She asked. Edgar Hale removed his hat. Ma'am, the Crudup boys and Virgil hung poor old Willie Jackson in a tree out back of the store by the railroad tracks yesterday, he told her as she put her hand to her mouth and gasped. That poor little boy. Hap just shook his head. Willie was a good boy, and that damn clan ain't worth shit at that. He spat a stream of tobacco over the porch rail. I damn sure hope you find him and hang 'em all, he said. Now, armed with the information that they needed, Leonard and Edgar borrowed the telephone and made a call to the office. Leonard Payne and I are going to head up to White Rock to arrest the Crudup boys for murder. Can you send us a deputy? We might need one, he said, hanging up the telephone. But it turned out that they had backup waiting on them. As they rounded the bend in the rutted road leading to White Rock, they saw Aldous Wells sitting aside that big old horse of his at the side of the road, armed with a high-caliber rifle for the occasion, and he looked angry. The standoff at White Rock made the newspaper on Sunday, and it was all the talk for quite a while around those parts. Ricky Crudup and his brother were waiting for the law, holed up in the stand of poplars above that old house of theirs in the holler, and there was an all-out gunfight, but Leonard, Sheriff Hale, Deputy Hines, and Aldous Wells made short work of them. Aldous fired the shot that got Ricky in the shoulder, and he fell from the side of the ridge and hit his head on a rock. He lay unconscious in the leaves as his brother Caleb gave up and ran down to his side. He surrendered. Deputy Hines and the sheriff hauled them both away. They left Ricky at the hospital, where he lay unconscious for 3 days before coming to again, and Ricky was locked up in the county jail to await trial. When the Crudup brothers learned that Willie had been Effie Jackson's favorite nephew, they both had a look of fear on their faces. They'd heard the stories about what Effie could do, what she'd done to those Haskins boys back in the day when they robbed and killed her husband Jim, and their fear only grew when they learned that Virgil had died in the Starlight jail the night before after he was arrested. The following day was Willie's funeral. A service was held for him at the cemetery behind the church, and shortly after it was over, the Jackson family left for home again, and Virgil's daughter buried her no-count father down by the store in the valley on the back of his land, near the spot where Willie had been hung, because the church said they didn't want his sorry bones in their hallowed ground. Ricky Crudup was never the same after the fall he'd taken off the ridge. He couldn't talk right, and he walked with a limp, and he couldn't see out of his left eye, and his brother Caleb had horrible nightmares for weeks on end until one night he hanged himself in his jail cell with a strip of his blanket. After the trial and his sentencing, Ricky was finally sent to a sanitarium for the criminally insane up north of Chattanooga, and there he remained until he died. Aldous Wells left the antlers from the buck he and Willie had killed together on Willie's grave. He thought it only fitting.